And the mandate hasn't changed. So the mandate from Genesis 1 was to fill the earth with people who look like God, people who bear his image. Jesus, the mission is the same. Go make disciples, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So fill the earth with people who look like Jesus. John, I'm excited about the conversation we are going to have today. We're going to talk about the top 5 threats we see as we look at discipleship in America today. This is actually a conversation that I have wanted to have. You know, it's kind of been on our list of things to discuss probably for 6 months now, at least. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be really helpful for our audience because our whole mission is to help disciple makers live and share their faith in the everyday places of life. And so understanding what the top threats are to that mission, I think will be helpful both for an understanding, but also hopefully an avoidance of falling into those. So what about you? What thoughts do you have as we get ready to dive into this conversation?
Andrew, always good to be with you. Anytime we have a chance to talk about Jesus, disciple making, really spending time together. I'm thankful for our relationship and friendship and partnership in the kingdom. So not only just this topic, but every topic we have a chance to kind of be together. But this one is particularly important to us because I think it really highlights a why. Like, why is it so hard to find someone who will help you grow? Why is it so hard when you want to grow in your relationship with Jesus? Who's going to help me? How do I do that? So when we think about this idea of the 5 threats, top 5 threats, there's a whole bunch more than these 5, just to be frank from the jump off here. It really seeks to answer that why question, Andrew. Why will no one help me? Where are these people? How come I've never been discipled, or my pastor has never been discipled, or how does this actually work? So that's kind of the root of this.
Right. It's probably one of these 5 reasons that, like you're saying, that is so difficult if you're younger in your faith, why it's so difficult to find a seasoned disciple maker who has that heart and vision and is available to help you. But these are also things that you're going to face as you seek to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and make disciples. And John, this isn't something that we've just sort of sat around a table, the two of us, let's think through what are 5 threats. You and I have both been making disciples now for 25 plus years. And so this is lived experience type stuff. As we've traveled the journey over the past 25 years, these are threats that we've observed. Just as disciple makers, these are also threats that we've experienced, things that have come into our lives and been threats. So I want folks to know that this isn't just a kind of a thought experiment on our part. This is really us trying to cultivate or condense these are 5 things that we've seen over and over. So yeah, that's kind of where we're coming from in this particular conversation, and I hope it's helpful for folks. So maybe we should dive in.
Yeah, I think it's time. But just before we jump in, we want to say, if you're a disciple maker or you're on the journey to be a disciple maker, really, you're the focus of this channel. We want to help you. Into the Harvest really wants to help you be a disciple and make disciples everywhere you go. So you're really our focus, and that's why we want to talk about this topic. How can we help disciple makers be everything that Jesus has called them to be? And so maybe actually that's part of the kind of the inspiration of this is, all right, what do we know is going to get in the way of disciple makers actually being like Jesus in this area of their life?
Yeah, I would say an invitation that goes along with that. If you're listening to this and you are actively seeking to make disciples, or that's an aspiration that you have, we do want to be helpful to you. So, leave comments on the YouTube video on this. If there's questions, things that don't make sense, we're going to be more effective at encouraging you and helping you grow if we know what you're specifically up against. Oftentimes, what we get on comments on our videos are usually from people who are not believers, or they're not very focused on disciple making. And so But like you said, that's not really our target audience. We'll respond to those comments. But if you're someone who's trying to follow Jesus and help other people follow Jesus, you really are our target audience. You're our community, and we want these conversations to be helpful for you. So let's dive in with these top 5 threats, John. And the first threat to discipleship is that our discipleship is out of focus. And what we mean by that is that it's not centered on Jesus.
So when we talk about being out of focus, one of the phrases we like to use is Jesus-centered disciple making. And so if it's centered on Jesus, it's centered on his message. It's centered on his method. It's centered on his mission. So what has he called us to? So when we think about this idea of being out of focus, what we tend to do is, well, what is the message of the day? What's going on in culture? What kind of is the hot topic in Christianity versus Jesus's message, right? Or what is it I'm supposed to do? What is kind of the thing that's captured Christianity or the kingdom right now? Well, it's being a servant in this area or addressing this social issue instead of engaging in the mission of Jesus. And then probably actually the scariest thing out of those things is the method part. We just had a couple of iterations with Justin Gravitt on the podcast. We'll link those here for you, where he's just talking about having a focus on Jesus over and over and over again, and 7 tests that help keep you in line with Jesus. And the reality is that we would prefer every other method than Jesus's method. So it's not centered on Jesus. It's going to be out of focus.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. That conversation with Justin was great. We'll put a link in here so that folks can find that and listen to it. You know, we've said this over and over throughout the years, John, that the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that's really what we're talking about here. I mean, it's a little bit, it's a kind of a strange thing to say, but if you begin to really think about it, that is the challenge of following Jesus. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is Jesus. So, you know, it's possible for us to be doing the mechanics of discipleship, but leaving out the master. And, you know, I often tell my own story of coming to faith. I was actually introduced to Bible study by a coworker who was a Jehovah's Witness. And my first observation of disciple making was with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And they do a great job at the mechanics of making disciples. And so we need to be aware that it's possible to be actively and excellently involved in the mechanics of disciple making, but not actually helping people follow Jesus, not having him at the center of what we're trying to do. And so that's really what we're talking about here with, that's an extreme example, but it's very possible for us in our churches, true Christian churches, not cults, but true Christian churches, to be doing the mechanics of discipleship, but losing the focus of Jesus. And I think that is the top threat to discipleship in America today.
And it's sneaky, right? Like that's the crazy, sneaky thing about the whole thing is that we're just going to creep farther and farther away from Jesus. We had a couple examples of this from the scriptures. I'll share mine. If you can think about the Jewish people, what they have been doing all of their lives up until the point that Jesus comes, and they're still doing right now, for those who are practicing Jewish believers, they're looking for the return of the Messiah. They're on the watch. They know the prophecies. They're reading their own scriptures. They're looking at the tradition of following God, and they miss Jesus. So John 5:39 and 40. I'll just read it for us. And Jesus is actually talking to kind of the leaders of the day there. He says, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life." And I can't imagine if that really set with them. I can't imagine like how that would have just been like soul wrecking, But it's crazy. That's how we actually live today, Andrew, is that so many people are actually studying the scriptures, are quite learned, actually. They really know the God of the Bible, but are they actually in step with Jesus and in deeper and deeper and an ever deepening relationship with Jesus? So that was the kind of the thought that first came to me, John 5:39 and 40. And you had a second one, which I also think is very good, about the Mount of Transfiguration.
Well, this is always a challenge. There's a saying even in just this secular business world that there's so much noise that the ability to catch the signal in the noise is crucial, because there's so much coming at us. And this is, again, true for us as we go through life. And it's true for us in our churches, that there are so many things that are calling out to us that need attention, that are good things. Jesus is the signal. He's the one that we want to be able to pull out of all that noise and stay focused on, stay centered on, and to help other people. One way that we describe making disciples is helping people find Jesus and focus their lives on him. And it's that focusing their lives on him is what we're talking about here, that it's a threat to our discipleship when that's out of focus, when Jesus is not at the center. You shared from John 5, there Jesus is talking to people who were not yet his followers and were resistant to him. What's maybe even more crazy is the Mount of Transfiguration. These were his disciples, and they were in danger of drifting and not having Jesus at the center. So the Mount of Transfiguration story is found in multiple Gospels, but I'll just read a few verses from Matthew 17. Peter, James, and John go up with Jesus to a high mountain, and while there, they fall asleep, which seems to happen multiple times with the disciples. When they wake up, Jesus has been transfigured. He's been transformed. He's glowing. It says that his face shone like the sun and his clothes became as white as light. And a second thing that would have been shocking for them when they woke up is that Moses and Elijah were also there with Jesus talking to him. So Peter says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And I just love the way Matthew records this story, because it says while he was still speaking. So Peter's actually saying this, hey, let's
over top of him, interrupting him.
Yeah. And think about it. Probably for Peter, Moses and Elijah, I don't know how he knew that was the real Moses and Elijah, but that had to be crazy. That's he's following Jesus, this earthly man, but suddenly he has these historical heroes that he's looking at. So I don't know, for us, maybe it would be like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. I don't know, someone super famous and super revered from your nation's history. You have them there. So for Peter, it just makes sense that we would want to honor all 3 of these. In fact, maybe he felt like he was elevating Jesus. Hey, Jesus, I see you on the same level as these other 2 great leaders that our people have always looked up to. But while Peter is saying that, while he's still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And it says that when the cloud lifted, there was Jesus alone. Such an epic story. And I think just a great reminder that there are many great voices. There are people that we can and should learn from. The scriptures themselves have great examples of faith that we can learn from and emulate. But at the end of the day, we always want to stay centered on Jesus, focused on him. We want his voice to be the signal in all the noise that life is throwing at us. So that's the first threat to discipleship, is that our discipleship can be out of focus, not centered on Jesus. And John, we actually have created a resource that is available this year. It's available right now that can help people do that. So you want to say just a few words about that?
Yeah, this has actually kind of been a lifelong endeavor, through the years, God clarifying over and over again what are kind of the core elements of a discipleship pathway. So we've called it the Pathway series. And really it's 3 distinct books, the first one being Discovering Jesus. And so as you're looking at this first book called Discovering Jesus, what we're trying to help you do is to catch the story of Jesus in the whole of Scriptures, from beginning to end, who is Jesus. And really the skill we want to teach you and help you kind of get good at as you use that first book, Discovering Jesus, is learning how to discuss the scriptures and find Jesus in the scriptures. And then the second book, as you continue to grow and mature, becoming a disciple, is to help you learn how to study the scriptures, but really what are the core elements of being someone who focuses their life on Jesus. So find Jesus, focus your life on Jesus. And then the third book we've called Passing on the Faith. What I really like about that is some of our best tools that we've used over the last 25 years that we know can help you be a disciple, make disciples, and helps you communicate those and be a faithful proclaimer of who Jesus is. So if you can think about those three books, and we're using those locally, you're using them. We've used that book too for years and different iterations, probably for at least a decade. So you would be, if you grab that now, you're jumping in on 20 some odd years worth of kind of trying, how do we help people really keep their focus on Jesus? So those are really fun. I just ordered 50 for our local group. They're gone. I can't keep them in stock personally. In our own right. Personal ministry, people are really enjoying them. So it's been a lot of fun. We're happy to have those available for folks.
Yeah, we designed this to be a simple framework that you can use that keeps Jesus at the center. So just as John was saying, book 1 really helps people recognize Jesus. Book 2 helps them respond to Jesus. Book 3 helps them represent Jesus, and it'll help you do that. So this is something that we're trying to not just talk about, but provide resources for you guys so that you can use those in your own local areas as you seek to make disciples. But John, let's jump
Andrew,
into this.
Just real quick, I think this is worth saying. In 2 Corinthians, boy, there's just so many issues that Paul's trying to address in the Corinthian letters, but at the core, the foundational level of the issues, I think, is 2 Corinthians 11:3. And he says, he actually states very clearly what he's most afraid of. He says, I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. And I would issue, as some of you may or may not be familiar with the message of what's going on in Corinth, but it's a mess. The place has got all kinds of problems, but the foundational problem is our minds drifting away, their minds drifting away, being led astray from the simple and pure devotion to Jesus. So I think that's really what we're trying to say in this. Like, we, much like Paul, want to make sure we're not drifting away from Jesus. So that really is our first one. Like you said, we probably do need to move on. We could talk about this one forever, but I think that's a big part.
I think it's okay that we spent a little extra time on that one because I do think it is the linchpin. Like these other 4 threats, in a way, they all flow out of a failure to keep our lives focused on Jesus and our disciple making focused on Jesus. But this second threat to disciple making in America today is that our discipleship is impractical and impersonal. And specifically, what we want to encourage you to think about is that discipleship is something that must be embodied. So what are your thoughts on that one, John?
This is, I call this the in-between moments, Andrew. So nobody has questions on what it's like. What do you do at church? You just kind of look around, and during that church service, you stand up at certain times, you might sing, maybe you raise your hands if you're comfortable. Or maybe you do the low and open. I don't know, raise your hands. You've seen the different versions, right, of praise and worship?
Right.
It's Googleable. Like, if you want to check that out, it's pretty funny, actually, folks. But no one necessarily has questions on, well, what's my behavior like at Bible study or at like something that's very spiritual in nature. But what people really have questions about is, what do I do in between those very clearly spiritual moments? And so when our disciple making isn't face to face, when it's not heart to heart or life on life, we're left guessing at what it looks like to follow God in the in between moments. So when Jesus gives the call to the disciples where he says, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men, we're going to go and do life together. It's ridiculously practical because you're living every moment of the day together. So when we think we're going to kind of cram people in a room in rows and they're just going to kind of watch a screen or have someone teach and that's going to kind of transform everything, then we leave people with every question known to man. Like, well, immediately I'm going to go out to the parking lot and I'm going to be frustrated when I drive. What helps you keep from like getting road rage? Like, this sounds like a really stupid example, but this is very, very practical. And if you're never in a car with someone else, when someone cuts them off, that's a believer, and maybe you don't even know how to imagine how it would look to react differently. And I'm not trying to trivialize kind of like the day in and day out following Jesus. I think those are just actually really practical examples. So what Jesus did was he meant for it to be face-to-face, heart-to-heart, embodied. That teaching is about helping someone become something new, become something different. So I do think it's impractical. I do think it's impersonal, and actually just leaves people with questions. Like, I really want to change. How do I do that?
Right. What we're talking about here is the mode of disciple making. And on the one hand, what we're mostly familiar with is the idea of passive listening. So you've got a very charismatic, gifted teacher. Oftentimes this is a lead pastor, but it could also be a podcaster. It could be someone that you're listening to online, and you're absorbing information from that person. It doesn't mean that it's always impractical or always impersonal, but on a certain level it is, because you don't really know this person, you don't see their life. And what we're saying is that the mode of disciple making is shared life. Like you mentioned that phrase, life on life, so that when we actually go through life, Jesus did that with the 12. They were together a lot. And it wasn't just quantity, it was going through the different experiences, including the mundane experiences of life, and how do you order your life so that you're seeking first the kingdom. In the same way, we, to say it a different way, we don't want our disciple making to be impractical and impersonal. Just reverse it. Is your disciple making practical? Is it helping people figure out how to live this faith in practical ways day in and day out? And is it personal? Is it actually a relationship where you're sharing your life, you're sharing your heart, you're sharing your struggles, your failures, ways that you've been able to overcome those? The alternative is typically we substitute academia and rules in the place of personal, practical disciple making. So just kind of think about your disciple making, whether that's your experience or what you're offering others. Does it tend to be heady, overly academic? So of course we want to study the scriptures, we're going to do that. Doctrine is important. But is it overly academic where it's just information and theology and you never really touch on the everyday challenges of living the faith? And is it impersonal? Do people really know you? Do you know the people that you're learning from? Are you sharing life together? That's really what we're coming from. Last thing I'll say on this one, John, is I once heard a quote that it's only possible to impress people from a distance. It's only possible to impact people up close and personal. And that's just been a great reminder for me when I think about what do I really want to accomplish here in terms of the influence that I'm having on others. Do I want to impress them? Well, if that's true, I'll actually keep my distance. I don't want people to see too much into my life, because then they're going to see that I don't have it all figured out, that I make mistakes, that I fail. But the price of impacting people is that you can't impress them in a way. Now, actually, I think people do end up thinking more highly of us when we share our authentic selves, which doesn't mean that you have to have it all figured out. It just means that you need to be sincere and you need to be available to let people into your lives. And when we don't do that, that's a major threat to disciple making, because disciple making that is impractical and impersonal doesn't work.
Yeah, and God knew that. God knew sending Jesus. So kind of zooming back in on making sure it's centered on Jesus, this principle stands with Jesus, John 1:14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So God sent Jesus to be present and to show and to live it out, for it to be practical. And it was obviously very, very personal for the 12 and some of the crowd beyond that as it grew. So I do think there is this tendency to think, well, I've learned something new in my mind, so I've accomplished something. And so this is also a part of kind of how we live life and structure our lives these days is, oh, well, I watched a video on how to do something, so now I can do that something, rather than, no, I'm actually being changed. It is very practical and it's personal. And I'm not just watching the video, but I'm doing the steps alongside the video. It still falls short of like being embodied and but that's a little more the concept. And so we have to fight this urge to think, well, I was instructed, therefore I'm good. Instead, no, I walked through, I was challenged, I tried the things that were taught, and it's changing me. I'm becoming something new.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about this third threat. The third threat to disciple making in America happens when our discipleship is rooted in human strategy rather than divine revelation. What do you have to say about that, John?
Yeah, my favorite quote when it comes to this is, particularly since what's appreciated most in Christendom is church, and the form and mode of church. So when I think about this, I heard someone very wise say that we think preaching programs and praise and worship make disciples. And it simply, they do not. They do not make disciples. But this is a man's strategy at, well, how do we fill a building? How do we pay our bills? How do we grow a community? How can we be engaged in the community around us to help other people find it? And we just actually stop short of the main thing. We stop short of Jesus. We stop short of Jesus's tactics. And we stop short of Jesus teaching the people individually because we're putting our focus on a very well-polished speaker who can preach very well. I'm not against that. I love that. So the application here isn't to like have less preaching and poor preaching. The application is actually, okay, well, how is God helping people learn and grow and drawing them into relationship? So, but if you think about it, any church that you've gone to, that you've experienced, there's a lot of effort put into those 3 Ps: preaching, programs, praise, and worship. Instead of people connecting deeply with God and allowing God to change them. And so that's just a really typical way. And it's really true that we've kind of like made Christianity, we made following God in America, since that's our context. This may not be true for some of you that are listening overseas. We've actually made that a business. We've made it a consumable. We've made it a product that we package to people, which is very much so rooted in human strategy. If we just hit these wickets, it'll grow, it's going to go, we'll make a difference. Rather than if we just connect with God and help people be connected with God, it'll grow, it'll go, because God's doing it.
E.M. Bounds wrote a great little book, a little over, probably about 150 years now, but it's called Power Through Prayer. I would highly recommend folks check it out if they have not already. Power Through Prayer by E.M. Bounds. And his opening chapter talks about the tragedy. One of the saddest things that you can see as you go through life is men trying to do God's work using men's methods. And that really hit me because I thought, well, it would seem like the saddest thing would be people just being completely clueless to God and just, out in left field. But no, he said, when men are trying to do God's work, but they're trying to use man's method, that's very sad. And we can all fall into that. There's so many stories from the scriptures, I think about the famous story about David wanting to move the ark to Jerusalem. And it was a good idea. His heart was in the right place, but he didn't do it the right way. God had given very clear instructions on how the ark was to be transported. It was supposed to be carried by hand by a specific type of person, the Levites, the priests. And they didn't do that. They put it on a cart, and they had 2 guys who were helping keep it steady as they made the journey from this village to Jerusalem. And at one point, the oxen stumbled and the ark was in danger of falling off the cart. So this guy reaches out to prevent that from happening. Again, this is a good thing. We don't want this sacred object to fall off the cart and possibly be damaged or broken. And, God ends up striking this man dead when he touches it. And it says that David was angry and David was afraid. And I think that's often what will result when we try to do God's work using man's methods, and it doesn't go the way we thought it would. We can become angry, we can become afraid, and we can actually blame God. David initially, he blames God. God, why would you kill this guy? Then he goes back and he studies and he realizes, oh, that was actually my bad. That guy died because I did not do God's work God's way. And it's an extreme story, but I think it's good for us to think about that and to realize that, we talked about keeping the main thing. We talked about the mode of disciple making, and here we're talking about the methods, the how we go about making disciples. And it's not that there aren't methods. So we're not saying that you should just, wing it and whatever works. No, quite the opposite. We're saying God has a way, and God's work, Jesus is both the foreman of that work, but he's also the blueprint. We should be studying the life of Jesus. How did he make disciples? How did he go about representing the Father? And then as closely as possible, follow in those footsteps. John, we've talked about this a lot over the last 5-6 years since we've been doing this podcast. The number one resource that I would recommend on this is the book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, which is just a deep dive study into the life of Jesus. We have a companion study guide that we've put together that folks can use, so we'll put that in the show notes. But it's important to follow the blueprint, and that blueprint is Jesus himself.
Yeah, and we will constantly be in trouble when we're trying to find and devise our own plan. I mean, that's just all there is to it. If you think about this story, maybe one of the sharpest rebukes in all of Scripture is when Jesus mashes up Peter. There's just like this epic moment of faith for Peter. Nope, we believe you're the Christ, you're the person. And it's not, who knows between paragraphs how much time passes by, but it's pretty close. And Jesus is talking about, I'm going to go to the cross, I'm going to be crucified, all these things. And Peter's like, nah, man, that ain't going down. And Jesus just goes off on him. He turns to him and says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And if you're in Peter's shoes, you're like, God, I've learned so much from you. Jesus, I've learned so much from you. I know you're from the Father. We know who you are. You are the Messiah. Surely this isn't the plan. The plan isn't for you to go to the cross and, man, let's get this kingdom spun up, man. Let's change the world. What are you thinking? And Jesus is like, hey, it's pretty clear what the Father wants me to do, and I'm going to the cross, But even farther back, Andrew, this all started with Adam and Eve in the garden. What happens when they take and eat of that fruit is they've divorced what is good from being defined solely by God. And now all of a sudden we think we can determine good absent from God. So the very first decision they make is they hide themselves from God. They're ashamed. It's not, oh, hey, God, we totally messed this up. Can you help us fix this? No, the very first thing they do is, man's response to a problem, because now good and the way life should be lived is divorced from God, and that's a very natural thing we'll face every day. So this is human nature, to find our own strategies, to kind of just think, if we just do it this way, this will happen. If I just pray this prayer, this will happen. If we kind of work in our own way of doing things, when God is like, hey, look, I sent you an example in Jesus. Do the strategy. It'll play out the way we want it to play out. But I just had a friend of mine, I asked him the other day, I was like, why do we so naturally hate the strategies of Jesus? Like, what makes us just not be excited about making disciples? And we had this conversation just this weekend, you and I, Andrew, that it was a pretty fledgling movement of Christians for a really long time. But Jesus' strategy to change the world over time has been unstoppable. It's this unstoppable force, but we would much rather see something faster. So we kind of have what is rooted in this human strategy rather than divine relation is I'm going to speed this. I'm going to get out in front of God. I can find a better tactic. When he's instead inviting us into, hey, this is the tactic. Do it.
Man, you see this, I see this happening right now. And it's funny because it really parallels, again, just the secular world. And I don't mean secular as an insult, just, business. Business is all about scaling. And in the modern age, it's all about how can I create a product and then scale it? That's how we're really going to have an impact and ultimately make money. And the church has really adopted this, we want to make disciples, and then, we want to scale this very, very quickly. And again, if we go back to Jesus as our blueprint, then it's not just the methods that he used, but part of that is the timeline that he used, the amount of time that he invested in those disciples. And I think you're right. Sometimes we just want to improve on the method of Jesus. I think that's part of human nature, and it's always a mistake. The best thing that we can do, Jesus said, is to become like the teacher. We're not going to be greater than the teacher. And the sooner we accept that teaching of Jesus, the more freedom that we will have, and the less that threat will come at our disciple making, that we're simply trying to root our disciple-making strategy in human methods versus what God has revealed. So let's talk about this fourth one, John. The fourth threat to disciple-making in America is when our discipleship is not engaged in mandate or mission. And we've got Genesis 1 and Matthew 28 listed here. So tell me a little bit more about what we mean by here of not being engaged in mandate or mission.
Yeah, these are two kind of epic commands from God. So we often say in Genesis chapter 1, first command, first priority. Genesis 1:28, when God commands Adam and Eve to be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over everything that moves upon the ground. So it was always God's intention for Adam and Eve to join God in the work of more people being created in his image. And so that's the beginning of time where Jesus was present, right? That's our theology teaches that. Our scriptures teach that. All the way through to right before Jesus returns and goes back to the Father. And he says, therefore, go make disciples of all nations. Now, I know they don't feel like the same. It's not the exact same words, but it's the exact same purpose. It's the exact same mission. So when we sell the Christian life as like a self-help or better your life or your world's going to be better, you're going to be happier, and we don't give people the full picture of, no, you're joining God in his work, then this is going to kill disciple making. Because it inevitably ends up being about me. It ends up being self-focused when from the very, very beginning, Adam and Eve is invited into the work of God. And Jesus challenges every disciple to therefore go make more disciples. So this is a pretty dangerous kind of slippery slope, particularly in a very self-help, better your position, have a better life kind of world that we live in. That's why why we're saying 5 top threats in America is this is the American dream. Better your life. Do have the white picket fence and 2 cars with a garage and whatever else it is. So this is very clear in disciple making. Come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Those are kind of our invitation. So that's how I'd start this bit of it, Andrew. The thing that stinks about this so much, Andrew, is that there's so much joy and life and understanding and depth. And kind of this picture of this well kind of rushes up in you. And John, I'll give you this living water, this beautiful picture of life that comes from when we actually give ourselves away. So few people get to engage with the Lord in mission. And they're kind of like almost in a holding pattern, or they feel like, well, maybe I'm missing something about God. It's because we have not married those things together. This is salvation. This is his message. But this is his method and this is his mission he's inviting you into.
Right. And the mandate hasn't changed. So the mandate from Genesis 1 was to fill the earth with people who look like God, people who bear his image. Jesus, the mission is the same. Go make disciples, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So fill the earth with people who look like Jesus, who himself is the image of God. That mission hasn't changed. That mandate hasn't changed. And you're right. Some of the big threats that we're up against in the church today in America is that we promote a health and prosperity gospel. Hey, come follow Jesus and you're going to be wealthier. Your life is going to improve for your own sake. And that often is a byproduct of following Jesus. When we live by biblical principles, life often does go better for us. That's the book of Proverbs in a nutshell. Also, another threat that isn't necessarily health and prosperity, but is in this same line, because like you said, it's focused on how our lives are going to get better if I follow Jesus, is a therapeutic deism. And we had a great conversation with Jim Cameron on that a year or so back that we could put a link in, where he talks about why that is such a danger. That he follow Jesus and your inner well-being is going to be improved. Your mental health, your anxiety. Again, Jesus does bring hope and health for us, but he's calling us to find that joy, to find that fulfillment in the context of working alongside him. And, you had mentioned Matthew 28. I often say that, the first words of Jesus and the last words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew are the bookends of disciple making. Matthew 4:19, Jesus says, "Come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Come follow me. Matthew 28:19, go make disciples. And that's really what Jesus is still calling us to do. Come follow him. Go make disciples, but it's always with that in view. Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. So from the very beginning, the expectation and the invitation is become a disciple so that you can get involved with what God is doing in the world. You can become like Jesus and pass on the faith.
This is lost. I don't know how we lost this, but this is lost in America. It really is. Come follow me and attend service. Come follow me, be a good person. Come follow me, read your Bible, So if we did that mashup a little differently, we could put a whole lot of things in there besides come follow me and I'll make you a fisher of men. Come follow me, go make disciples. And that might actually be a really cool exercise just to think, what was Jesus' message? Come follow me, and then give me 3 more words, and just see what people would answer. I think you would have 1,000 different things, and it wouldn't be go make disciples. Come follow me and love people well, whatever it may be here. So there is a method to Jesus's madness when he's talking to the disciples, and they don't even completely understand, but they know they're signing up to something. Like, come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. And it says immediately they dropped their nets and followed him. But then it got clearer, and it got clearer, and it got clearer. But they knew from the beginning that God was going to help them become something new by the end of their time with Jesus. And that's what we have to help people engage with. And for you, for me, for so many of our friends that have become disciple makers, this is the life-giving kind of like a aspect of following Jesus. I don't know if you've seen this movie, Kicking and Screaming, but Mike Ditka's coaching this coach on how to be a better coach. You seen this movie? And he says that coffee's the lifeblood of champions. Mission is the lifeblood of disciple makers and generations that come after disciple makers. Understanding that God's called us into his purpose. He's called us into, and for our pleasure, for us, not because he needs us, but because we get to enjoy partnering with him. This is the lifeblood of disciple making. And if mission isn't entered in there, it's almost like everything's like oxygen depleted. There's no blood flow, like the extremities kind of wear away, and little by little you just kind of fizzle away and you become lifeless, because God is giving us this invitation for our benefit to partner with him in mission.
Yeah. And for his purpose, like God has always wanted us to be in his image. He's wanted us to work alongside him from the very beginning. We often say that two things are true for you as soon as you become a follower of Jesus. First, you're part of the family of God. Second, you're part of the family business. Those two things happen immediately when you begin to follow Jesus. And it's a major threat to disciple making when our discipleship is not engaged in that family business, when it's not tied directly to the mandate and mission. But let's talk about this last one, John. The fifth threat to disciple making in America is when our discipleship is overly complicated. And we had a couple of quotes here. I don't know if you want to read those, and we can just kind of wrap up this conversation today.
Nature is pleased with simplicity, from Isaac Newton. Leonardo da Vinci said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. These are really good, because if you just think about your life and the things that have made the most impact, they're usually not complicated. They may not be easy, but they're almost always simple. And even things that you've learned about Jesus and your relationship with Jesus, if you like take a step back and like, wow, that's remarkably clarifying and simple. The complication usually comes from having to do it and figuring out what it actually looks like. But so come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men is very simple. The gospel story is actually not very complicated at all. It's very simple, but it's very, very profound. And so I think these ideas of following Jesus and all of the challenges and how foggy that is brings its clarity back from Jesus. So as we focus on him, we keep our focus there. It brings back a clear simplicity. But then also being around other believers who want to make disciples brings this kind of clarity. So I love that about Jesus. He spends time with them. He gives them the invitation, come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. And he ends with teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. So there's this massive clarity to, what do I do? What does my disciple making look like? How do I do that? I teach them what Jesus has taught me, and I teach them to obey what Jesus has taught me to obey. And I think that's really, really important.
I like seeing this simplicity as virtuous, because I think we instinctively reverse that. We tend to think of maturity or expertise as being complex. So when I think about a lawyer, I'm like, well, I could never be a lawyer. The legal document is so complicated. I need an expert, a lawyer, to accomplish that for me. Or if I think of a doctor, I could never be a doctor. It's so complex, what they're doing. That's beyond me. And we can sort of put that same template on disciple making. We can say, well, I can never be a disciple maker because surely it's so complex and so complicated. And sadly, as leaders in the church, we can also promote that we are experts because we understand all these intricacies and all these complex theological truths, or we're so gifted and capable of doing things that most people can't do. And that is devastating to disciple making, to take that approach, to have that attitude, when really the reverse is true. Jesus was such an amazing disciple maker because it was so simple. He kept it so simple. Both his message and his methods were highly pass-onable. In fact, if you think of Jesus 2,000 years ago, he didn't write a book. We've put together the Pathway series. You can go buy it on Amazon. Jesus didn't have that. Jesus, the first gospel, most conservative scholars think that Mark was probably the first gospel, and it was written sometime maybe in the mid-60s AD. Well, that's 30 years after Jesus, and yet his teachings were so pass-onable that they were just communicated word of mouth. And they were so sticky that these were the greatest hits. Mark's gospel is something that most believers would have been familiar with a lot of those stories because that's what Christians were talking about. They were talking about the parable of the soils and the sower. They were talking about the works that Jesus did. And they were following the methods that Jesus used when he made those first disciples. So yeah, simplicity is virtuous. We always want to be thinking about how can I make this more pass-onable, both what we're communicating through our words, but also how we're living our lives. How could a younger believer take what I'm trying to pass on and not only understand it and live it, but they could turn around and pass it on. Now, we don't want to dumb down the faith, so that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about reducing the truth. What we're saying is always striving to communicate the truth in a faithful way, in the most simple words, in the most simple language, in the most simple manner.
Yeah, Justin Gravitt, not to refer to him over and over again, but he has this phrase, bolted on, not baked in. That our disciple making is bolted on, not baked in. And for me, that actually is about a simplicity. It's so when we're trying to make disciples, we just say, oh, well, we got to add something into this or add something onto this. And if you've ever retrofitted anything, if you've ever worked on anything in your life and you're trying to retrofit something, it can turn into a nightmare super quick. You got to add a new part to a 1950s automobile, or like a new thing into a computer, and you're trying to retrofit something old with a new part. It's super difficult. So what Jesus did instead was he lived his life, and disciple making was his life. That was his plan and his strategy. I'm going to obey the Father. Watch me obey the Father. Now that I'm gone, obey the Father and invite people in to watch you obey the Father. And the Holy Spirit will be with you all the way. So when I think about this idea of simplicity and it being the ultimate sophistication, what really helps me think about that is that actually my training program is my life. I'm making a commitment to follow Jesus, and I'm inviting people to do that life with me. And the training program ends up being me just trying to be faithful. And they get to see, unlike Jesus, when they're with me, they get to see all the mistakes and all the mess ups and me repenting before Jesus. They get to see me apologize to people for misrepresenting Jesus and his message and his methods, his mission. And I think that idea is really captured, Andrew, in the Matthew 28:19, where he says, therefore, go and make disciples. And many people have studied that, us included. There's this picture of while you are going, make disciples. While you're living your life, it needs to be an everyday part of your life. Just invite people in to see you try and be obedient to Jesus, to watch you. So, he uses another phrase, I've given you example in John 13:15. So life on life is the vehicle here. That brings the simplicity. Even if you're continuing to learn and grow, which you should be all the way to the end, you can still invite people to watch you live your life of obedience before Jesus. So regardless of where you're at on that journey, you can really help other people begin to live a life of discipleship and become disciple makers.
And this really just becomes something that guides all of your life and your disciple making, the value of trying to communicate the truth in as simple a form as possible. I often think of reducing things to the lowest common denominator. We never say 500 1,000ths or 4/8. You always want to reduce it down to 1/2, 1/2. Now, you can't reduce it any further than that. And so that's where I say, we do want to communicate the truth of the gospel and the truth of Jesus and the truth of discipleship, but we want to do it at a lowest common denominator level. And that's something that we're all learning. So, you don't feel like you have to be doing this perfectly, but have this as an aspiration as you live your life and as you make disciples to value simplicity. And I think it's actually one of those inside out things with the kingdom of God that we tend to admire complexity. But when it comes to disciple making, simplicity is a virtue. So, John, why don't we wrap this up? I'm going to quickly just recap these top 5 threats to disciple making in America, and then we can give some final thoughts here. So the top 5 threats to disciple making in America: number 1, when our discipleship is out of focus, not centered on Jesus. Number 2, when our discipleship is impractical and impersonal rather than embodied. Number 3, when our discipleship is rooted in human strategies instead of God's revelation. Number 4, when our discipleship is not engaged in the mandate and mission of God. And number 5, when our discipleship is overly complicated. So those are the top 5 threats as we see them. Any final thoughts from you, John, as we wrap this up?
Yeah, I just think that it goes back to that kind of foundational element, is that what do we do over and over and over again as disciple makers? We go back to Jesus. I shared this maybe a couple weeks ago on the podcast that had an opportunity to share with a group of disciple makers over Labor Day weekend. And the topic that we were talking about is vision of Jesus. So what is vision? And it's kind of this phrase that gets thrown around, and well, that means generations, or that means discipleship, or that means evangelism. What is vision? And so when I think about vision, I think vision is an ever increasing focus on Jesus. And that always, over and over, we're coming back to Christ. And any question that I have, that doesn't mean I don't read the scriptures, the entirety of the scriptures. Come on, all of those are helping me to really focus on Jesus. But what it does mean is that I have greater clarity the longer I live on who is Jesus, what did he say, what did he do, and how can I be more and more like him. And you mentioned this, Andrew, that when we think about this idea, this is choices that we make as God's people. This isn't forced upon us by something outside of our control. So we have chosen to allow ourselves to be pushed away and kind of led astray by Satan and his craftiness from the simplicity and devotion to Jesus. So if you want to be a disciple, don't forget who the disciple maker is. And that's Jesus. You partner with him. Ever increasing focus on him, and it'll all buff.
That's what I would encourage people as we reflected on these 5 things that we've observed and we've experienced. They're all within our control. So they're not external threats that the church is facing. And oftentimes that's how we can feel, is like, oh, the top threat to disciple making in America is culture. We've lost the culture. The top threat to disciple making is politics. We have people who are going to try to change the society through politics, and Christians are too political or they're not political enough. These 5 threats, if we don't fall prey to them, will help us make disciples the way Jesus did. And they're all within our control. So we wanted to have this conversation just to highlight them so that people can be on the lookout for them. There may have been some, as we discussed them, where just immediately the Holy Spirit impressed upon you that, oh, yeah, that's something I need to work on. I've been falling into that error, or that I've been falling prey to that threat. But we also have, like I said, this is why we have this show, John. This is why we do podcasts. This is why we're active on social media, is we want to inspire disciple makers. We want to encourage you that you can do this. God has called you to this. We want to bring clarity to disciple makers, to help them have this focus and to see these threats. And we want to resource disciple makers, both with tools, but also with materials that they can use in their disciple making. So I hope this conversation is encouraging and that folks can take advantage of some of the tools that we've discussed here, that we'll link in the show notes. The Pathway series, which you can pick up and use as you make disciples. The Master Plan of Evangelism study guide, which you can download and use to dial in your own blueprint on disciple making and pattern it after Jesus. So, this is always a fun conversation. I'm glad we were able to do it today, John.
Yeah, great being with you, Andrew. Into the Harvest Gang. Those of you who are seeking to be a disciple, make disciples, keep your eyes on Jesus. He's the author and perfecter of our faith.